I'm David Perkins. I'm a professor emeritus at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, former director of Project Zero, and still very active in projects trying to make sense of the world of education and make it better. And I have a question for you. Think back to when you were in elementary school or high school. What was worth learning for you? I don't mean just the obvious stuff like basic literacy and basic math, but besides that, what really made a difference? I love that question. I've asked it of many people, and I think that question, what's worth learning, is absolutely fundamental to making sense of the world of education and deciding how best to educate. A lot of the research is about how to learn well, and that's terribly important. But it's not quite the same thing as what's worth learning. Let me give you a favorite example. I love to ask audiences, who studied the quadratic equation? All the hands go up. Everybody studied the quadratic equation. And then I like to ask, who has used a quadratic equation in the last 10 years? And most of the hands go down, but there's still a few. And then I like to ask, okay, who's used a quadratic equation in the last 10 years outside of an educational context? And then almost all the rest of the hands go down. Maybe there's one left. And it's wonderful to ask that person, what did you do with the quadratic equation? And they'll have a little story, and it makes sense. And it's great that at least one person in 100 found something to do with it. Now, when I do this, math teachers get mad at me. They say, oh, you don't like math. You don't think math is meaningful. Actually, my degrees are in mathematics. I love math. I think the quadratic equation is fascinating. But that's just me. In schools, I always think we should have an opportunity for people to learn what's really engaging for them. And I was engaged in a lot of math. But that's not quite the same question as what our general policy and general curriculum is going to be like. So why the quadratic equation? Today, a lot of math educators ask the same question. And if not the quadratic equation, what? Well, what about statistics and probability? Now, it may sound dry, but it doesn't have to be dry because that's a matter of the art of teaching. And statistics and probability come up all the time in your life. They come up in insurance decisions. They come up in looking at various government and school policy. What percentage of this, what percentage of that? They come up in gambling decisions. They come up endlessly. If there's one piece of math that's really empowering and smart to know about, it's some of the fundamentals of statistics and probability. Much more useful than the quadratic equation. In fact, if you do the same question routine, how many people have used some statistics and probability in the last 10 years, or even in the last month? The hands stay up. You can't get away from it. It's not just math, it's any discipline. Let's take history. I know something about, and you know something about, the story of various periods of history. And in the most straightforward history classes, that's what we learn. We learn the story of what happened, what caused this, what caused that, how did A lead to B. That's nice. It's good to have a lot of knowledge about that. But how often does one find it useful to plug in a narrative over 10 or 20 or 30 years to making sense of today's world, or even making sense of another historical period? For instance, what if we organize the teaching of history around what you might call historical turning points, and what made those turning points and what they led to? Say the French Revolution, or say the Industrial Revolution. What happened and how did it cause a swerve? And how does that kind of swerve map forward into what's happening today? That's worth learning. In general, we might think about what's worth learning in terms of big understandings. Understandings that give us insight, that maybe sometimes give us an ethical perspective, that inform our actions in the world, and most basically that actually come up so all the hands don't go down, that actually come up in our lives and enrich and empower us as we navigate the world. That's what education ought to be made of, and very often isn't so much. It's made of legacy topics. Side by side with big understandings, by the way, I would put big questions. Big questions like, for instance, what are the historical pivot points? Or why is there so much conflict in the world? Big questions. And one of the biggest questions we began with, what's worth learning?